Good afternoon. I want to say a few thank yous once again to the many, many people who made this a very, very special year. Thank you, Patty, for that most generous introduction. Thank you to Kathy Finley, the executive director of the OAH, who was so splendid all year in helping me to serve you the way I wanted to. To the program committee chairs, Bruce Schulman and Rosemary Zagari, thank you. And thank you also to Cliff Kuhn and Jamil Zinaldin, the chairs of the local resource committee. Most of all, I want to thank my wife, Deborah Kraut. As some of you know, Debbie has not been in good health in recent years, and her physician strongly suggested that she not make this trip to Atlanta. Debbie and I have been married for over 40 years, and she is not only the love of my life and sometimes collaborator, but my closest and truest friend. Those of you who have been married that long know exactly what I mean when I say friend. She knows many people in this audience. She has been to the OAH many, many times. I spoke to her last night, and she sends you her warmest greetings. Last but not least, I want to thank my daughter Julia for her support and the sheer joy of being her father. A father remembers the long walks through Lower Manhattan and the questions, gee, that was a really tall building, and the time when she got on her knees so she could get her head into the microfilm reader, and so she and I could giggle together about the advertisements from an earlier era. Very, very special. Thank you, Julia. This is a year of important anniversaries, and as you know, American historians love anniversaries. It is especially important for those of us who study matters of migration, race, religion, and ethnicity. It is the 90th anniversary of the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act. That law's national origins quota system curved a wave of immigration to the United States that had brought approximately 23.5 million newcomers to America's shores. The law was constructed in such a way as to particularly disadvantage the Southern and Eastern Europeans so despised by many Americans for their religions or the hue of their skin. The Johnson-Reed Act pushed the immigrant away. Next year, we can celebrate the 50th anniversary of its repeal. This year is also the 60th anniversary of the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, which did not end racial discrimination in the United States, but did position the American legal system on the side of racial integration of public schools. It was a step toward bringing African Americans in, especially young people who had been left out because of the color of their skin. And 2014 also marks the 50th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which made it illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Its intent was to end unequal application of voter registration requirements, racial segregation in schools, discrimination in the workplace, and in public accommodations. It, too, was designed to bring people in. The flap on the big tent of American life does not always blow in one direction, but gradually, albeit not without struggle, the entrance gets a little wider. In the room in our midst this afternoon are many scholars who have chronicled and analyzed this pattern of decreasing exclusion and increasing inclusion, and some whose own personal experiences testify to this fundamental social change. Yet, today's headlines contradict the notion that the present is a sharp break with the past. Currently, 40.4 million residents of the United States are foreign-born, some 13% of the population and far greater than any other country in the world. Approximately 11 million are undocumented, and most of them live in fear that the flap of the big tent will open only to boot them out. As Congress drags its feet revising immigration policy, one of the issues discussed in Washington think tanks, including the Migration Policy Institute, where I'm honored to be a non-resident fellow, is the lack of a national blueprint for integrating immigrants into American society. Instead, state and local governments, religious groups, not-for-profit organizations, NGOs, if you will, concern themselves with language learning, job training, and family services. The National Research Council has recently appointed a panel to examine the process of how we assimilate new arrivals. Among the questions investigators are asking is, how did we assimilate immigrants in the past? How has the metamorphosis of identity from alien to American occurred throughout our history? See, historians have a role to play. Assimilation is an American perennial. Because migration has been and continues to be so central to the peopling of the United States, the subsequent process of integrating newcomers into American society has been an essential and recurring aspect of the American narrative. For those of us who study the migration of peoples across the globe and the pushes and pulls that put people in motion, assimilation is what happens after arrival. Or as I often like to think of it, it's what happens next. My quest to understand assimilation in American society began with a quotation that I came across in my reading for my first published book, The Huddled Masses. I came across some words from a guidebook aimed at those migrating to the United States. The title of the book was The Juden in America. It was The Jews in America, published in Yiddish in the port of Odessa in 1891. A Jewish physician who had already migrated to the US, Dr. George Price, explained a kind of negotiation between native and newcomer. These are his words. "Hold fast. This is most necessary in America. Forget your past, your customs, and your ideals. Select the goal and pursue it with all your might. No matter what happens to you, hold on. You will experience a bad time, but sooner or later you will achieve your goal. If you are neglectful, beware, for the wheel of fortune turns quickly. You will lose your grip." A bit of advice for you. Do not take a moment's rest. Run, do, work, and keep your own good in mind. A final virtue is needed in America. It's called cheek. Do not say, "I cannot, I do not know," end quote. So that was the deal, as Price understood it. Swap what you were before for what you might become in the United States. Assimilation was possible and profitable, but come prepared to pay the cost. Be sure you come prepared. The term assimilation has been much contested, of course, among scholars. In the early 20th century, University of Chicago sociologists such as Robert Park, Louis Wirth, Ernest Burgess studied the immigration of their era and believed assimilation to be possible and desirable. They defined assimilation as a process whereby newcomers were absorbed into or subsumed by the host culture. In their 5-volume study, The Polish Peasant in Europe and America, sociologists William I. Thomas and Florian Zanetsky concluded that Polish migrants did not transport the ways of the old world to the new, but that the newcomers developed an identity that was neither Polish nor American. The American experience was making them different, albeit not immediately the same as their American-born neighbors. By the 1930s, Theodore Blagin, George Stevens, Carl Wittke were publishing studies of Northern Europeans who had settled in the upper Middle West, explaining the contributions these groups were making to their new home. Perhaps the most lasting insight came from one of Frederick Jackson Turner's students, Marcus Lee Hansen. In a 1937 speech at Augustana College, Hansen observed in the gendered language of the era, "What the son wishes to forget, the grandson wishes to remember," end quote. Children of immigrants would embrace assimilation, but curious grandchildren, comfortable in their American identity, would seek knowledge of the family's roots. They wanted to know who they were. Hansen's observation, I think, explains why the process of assimilation was often ragged, uneven, spread over several generations. After World War II, Oscar Handlin, nourished by the scholarship at the Chicago School, wrote his flawed but poetic 1951 classic, The Uprooted. It depicted assimilation as an emotionally painful reaction to the social disorganization that resulted from leaving one society and going to another. Handlin's work launched a new enthusiasm for the study of immigration. Scholars who followed Handlin and studied European groups saw assimilation as a process of recasting new arrivals in a uniform, recognizable American mold. But what was that mold? Was it the so-called melting pot named for Israel Zangwill's 1908 play? Was it a salad bowl, a model suggesting that immigrants retained aspects of their distinctive ethnic and national identities, even as they were fully mixed into American society? By the last decades of the 20th century, these and other models were dismissed by a new generation of scholars who found the whole concept of assimilation, recasting new arrivals in a uniform, recognizable American mold, to be reductionist and an unsatisfactory analytical construct, because clearly it did not apply to Asians, to Latinos, to other peoples of color. They wished to center race, and older models grounded in ethnicity simply did not suffice. The word assimilation fell into disuse, with incorporation or integration deployed as substitutes. Assimilation was resurrected from history's dustbin thanks largely to sociologists Richard Alba and Victor Nee's 2003 volume, Remaking the American Mainstream, Assimilation and Contemporary Immigration. Observing contemporary migration patterns that have brought millions of Latin Americans and Southeast Asians and Caribbean peoples to the U.S. since the 1970s, many of them non-white, Alba and Nee concluded that members of these groups were empowered by the civil rights struggles of the previous decade to widen the American mainstream, which they defined as that part of society within which ethnic and racial origins have at most minor impacts on life's chances. While ethnic and racial origins still regulated opportunity, who was in and who was out of the mainstream had widened, had become more inclusive, not confined to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants or those capable of successfully emulating their way of being. I was very struck by Alba and Nee's argument that recent immigrants changed the social landscape as they nudged out a place for themselves in the American mainstream. But I believe that the process of widening that mainstream has been an earlier and recurrent theme with each generation of newcomers to reach our shores. Informed by Alba and Nee, I consider assimilation a process of mutual adaptation between native and newcomer, characterized by an ongoing negotiation that each individual newcomer conducts over the price of opportunity in the United States, a negotiation. Often, acceptance and opportunity come at great cost. Old ways of being, old identities must be abandoned and new ones taken on. But the degree and pace of change is never a foregone conclusion, and even as they transform themselves, immigrants influence how the broader society defines what it means to be an American. For those who wish to know how newcomers negotiate their inclusion in American life and their access to opportunities in the U.S., there is no better place to begin, I think, than consideration of the body. The body of the immigrant is contested terrain where the process of identity negotiation occurs most visibly. It is a zone of contention wherein the apprehensions of the native-born and the aspirations of newcomers repeatedly clashed in the past and continue to do so today. Health was the very first determinant, after all, as to whether those who traveled to our shores would be admitted or rejected. Beginning in the late 19th century, uniformed federal physicians at immigration depots such as Ellis Island in New York Harbor and Angel Island in San Francisco Bay conducted examinations and made diagnoses. Immigration officials relied upon those diagnoses in calculating whether a particular immigrant would be economically productive and self-sufficient, or whether illness or disability would prevent them from making a contribution, and perhaps even leave them to survive as public charges, dependent on the state or dependent on private charity. But admission was just the first step. Once through the golden door, even the healthiest immigrants had to deal with America's often negative reaction to their physical appearance, their clothing, their habits. Some native-born Americans saw it as their responsibility to advise newcomers on how best to transform how they looked and behaved. One such organization was the Daughters of the American Revolution. In 1911, the DAR commissioned a guide for the immigrant Italian in the United States of America. The author was John Foster Carr, a Yale University-trained teacher and writer. Later in 1914, he founded the Immigrant Publication Society, which provided information and advice to immigrants in their own language. Carr's advice echoed his own prejudices and the ethnic stereotypes of his day. For instance, he wrote, quote, "Italians are too ready to have recourse to violence and quarrels. If this habit could be given up, Italian immigrants would at once find themselves more welcome in America. For this is one thing that makes them distrusted." And then his advice in big, bold letters, "Throw away all weapons you may have. Speak in a low voice. Try not to gesticulate. Do not get excited in your discussions," end quote. In the Yiddish language version of the text, aimed at the Jewish immigrant community, Carr advised Jewish newcomers to, quote, "Join American clubs, read American papers, become an American citizen as soon as you can. It is an excellent thing for a Jew to join a military company, a regiment of the National Guard. Membership gives social advantages, and the opportunity of healthful exercise in athletic games and drills is very important to a man who lives in a great city. This service also makes the Jew better understood and appreciated by Americans. So Italians should put their guns down, Jews should pick them up." What should a Jew not do in the name of integration into American life? What price of acceptance should not be paid? Carr advised, quote, "Be proud of your race, your birth, and your family. Never change your name, except when absolutely necessary to simplify it for English pronunciation," end quote. No matter the language, Carr and the DAR offered the same kernel of advice, and in each of the books that I examined, and there were many, many of them in many different languages, this line was always retained: "Do as Americans do." But what is that? For many critics, immigration, radical changes in habits and behaviors would never be sufficient. Newcomers were just too different to ever assimilate into the American Republic. Some argued that late 19th and early 20th century arrivals, especially the two largest groups, Southern Italians and Eastern European Jews, would degrade America because of their biological inferiority. E.A. Ross of the University of Wisconsin argued in his 1914 volume, The Old World in the New, that the foreign blood being injected into the blood of our people was subcommon. His method of investigation, eyeball analysis. And his evidence, appearance. The frail physique of newcomers and such physical attributes as narrow and sloping foreheads, shortness and smallness of the crania, facial asymmetry. That's hard to imagine. Ross was hardly alone. Madison Grant, in his 1916 volume, The Passing of the Great Race, commented that just as Assyrian or Egyptian freedmen could not be transformed into a Roman by wearing a toga and applauding his favorite gladiator in the amphitheater, so it would be impossible to transform into an American the Polish Jew, whose dwarf stature, peculiar mentality, and ruthless concentration on self-interest are being engrafted upon the stock of the nation. That's a quote from Madison Grant. Those who deemed the immigrant bodies unassimilable, of course, did not go unanswered. Columbia University anthropologist Franz Boas, himself a German Jewish immigrant, demonstrated that the contested terrain of the body was subject to modification by changes in lifestyle. The American environment, including diet, exercise, health care, hygiene, was modifying the newcomer's appearance. Because the slope of the cranium was often regarded as a reliable index of race and was heritable, Boas measured the skulls of second-generation immigrants as well as other physical dimensions and discovered that many no longer physically resembled their parents' generation. Long-headed types grew shorter, round-headed types often developed elongated heads. In a 1911 report presented to the Congressional Commission investigating immigration, Boas concluded that nutrition and improved living conditions played a greater role in shaping what were presumed to be racial characteristics rather than heredity. Early in the 20th century, improvements in cosmetic surgery allowed physicians to offer newcomers a shortcut to changing those aspects of their appearance not affected by better living conditions. You could look as Americans looked. And the historical record indicates that some of the more affluent immigrants and their children found this to be a rather tantalizing proposition. Since ancient times, men and women have found ways of modifying their bodies to conform to prevailing standards of beauty or attractiveness in their society. Skin could be lightened with creams or darkened by suntanning. Hair could be curled or straightened. Men could grow beards or shave them off. The body could be altered or scarred for religious ritual or beautification. Of course, adjusting appearances could be risky. Many of us recall with a wince the pages in the autobiography of Malcolm X when Malcolm Little, or Detroit Red, as he was called in the 1940s, engages in conking to straighten his kinky hair, burning his scalp using congeline, a hair straightener made from lye. Detroit Red straightened his hair in response to the standards of attractiveness born of racism. Immigrants asked plastic surgeons to manipulate flesh and bone in response to similar prejudices. Just how contested the terrain of the body could be is amply reflected by a 1926 New York Times headline reading, quote, "Changes racial features. Young Japanese wins American bride by resort to plastic surgery," end quote. Shima Kito's surgery to westernize his eyes was perhaps the first plastic surgery of its kind in the United States. His marriage proposal had been rejected by Mildred Ross of Dubuque, Iowa, because though she proclaimed her love for him, she said that she could not devastate her parents by marrying someone so visibly of a different race. The surgeon whom Kito consulted cut the corners of Kito's eyes so that the slant appearance was eliminated. The surgeon also did some work on his nose and his lip to tighten his features. His future in-laws were sufficiently satisfied to permit an engagement. Kito told the New York Times that he also intended to change his name to William White, which according to the article is, quote, "is nearly an English equivalent of his native name," end quote. One can only wonder about what Kito and Mildred's children looked like and what they might want to do about it, end quote. While few Asians sought plastic surgery of Kito's type prior to World War II, after the war, surgery to westernize eyes became more common, perhaps because many of the arriving immigrants of the post-war era had been exposed to US films and magazines that celebrated American standards of beauty while they were in the Pacific Theater. Surgeons were becoming increasingly proficient at what they call revision of the Oriental eye, which usually involved altering the heavily padded Asian eyelid. Pressures to pursue plastic surgery were highly gendered, of course. While Makito was male, most patients consulting plastic surgeons were female. Many foreign-born women felt impelled to conform to American standards of beauty to improve their marriage prospects or open doors to professional opportunity beyond what cosmetics could accomplish. Asian immigrants have hardly been the only newcomers to choose the extreme option of surgery in pursuit of acceptance in American society. As historian Elizabeth Haken and others have noted, the early 20th century surgeries of New York's Dr. John Orlando Rowe and Berlin's Dr. Jacques Joseph inspired surgeons in various parts of the US to experiment with rhinoplasty, nasal plastic surgery. While terms such as over-large, humped, or too prominent were common, by 1892, plastic surgeon John B. Roberts was using a different vocabulary, terms such as the Roman nose, the Jewish nose, the nose with angular prominence on its dorsum, to suggest that nasal appearance could be associated with the facial features of Southern or Eastern Europeans, especially Southern Italians and Jews. In the aftermath of the great wave of immigration that ended in the mid-1920s, there was an increasing demand by newcomers and their children for assistance in altering their appearance, especially to make their noses less foreign-looking. As might be expected, surgeons encouraged the market. One wrote in 1930 that, quote, modification of accentuated family or racial characteristics, such are sometimes observable, especially in Semitic subjects, is not only a legitimate procedure, but is frequently of great importance to the individual, end quote. Dr. Vilray Papin Blair, from a prosperous and venerable St. Louis family, initially opposed doing such surgeries on principle, but he came around to a different point of view by 1936, explaining, quote, change in the shape of the prominent Jewish nose may be sought for either social or business reasons, end quote. If physicians saw themselves as behaving in the best interests of their patients, those seeking cosmetic surgery saw nothing wrong with their decision, and most denied a desire to camouflage their ethnic or religious identities. They simply wanted to look like everyone else, or almost everyone else. In a stunning 1953 study, New York University researcher Frances Cook McGregor and her collaborators conducted surveys of plastic surgery patients. McGregor reported in her volume, Facial Deformities and Plastic Surgery, a Psychosocial Study, that in addition to wishing to conform to American standards of attractiveness for purposes of assimilation, non-Jewish foreign-born and their children seeking rhinoplasty sometimes feared being mistaken for Jews. This group of non-Jews included Italians, Armenians, Greeks, Iranians, and Lebanese. McGregor found that individuals in all these groups wanted to surgically alter their noses that they might be visible clues to an ethnic or religious group that they perceived as having unfavorable or stigmatic connotations. In other words, they didn't want to look like a stigmatized group. In a society where considerable anti-Semitism still prevailed, McGregor wrote, quote, a large convex nose, the Jewish stereotype, may automatically assign to its possessor all the physical, mental, emotional, and moral characteristics with which the group is supposedly endowed. The permeability of American identity was the topic of Arthur Miller's 1945 novel, Focus. The compelling story of Lawrence Newman, a non-Jew and a bit of an anti-Semite, whose appearance is changed by a pair of new eyeglasses in a way that causes others to see him and relate to him as a member of the reviled minority. Commenting on his narrative, Arthur Miller wrote, quote, with so many different nations represented in the people of this country, one can hardly have spent a life here without having been mistaken at least once for an Italian, a Pole, and an Irishman. Anything one is not. As one Italian to another, I have been regaled with the tales of Irish perfidy. Strictly speaking, between us Jews, I have been made the confidential hearer of the latest lousy WAP story. As one American to another, I have been told why foreigners always act the way they do, end quote. The extent of assimilation, or at least conformity to the American ideal through surgery, is hard to tease out with precision because statistics were very rarely kept on the motive for requesting the operation. But occasionally, cosmetic surgery sought by celebrities made headlines, and everybody was talking about it. When comedian Fanny Brice had rhinoplasty in 1923, she was much criticized within the Jewish immigrant community and was roasted in the press. The press, both Yiddish and non-Yiddish. One English journalist, American journalist, Dorothy Parker, a charter member of the famed Algonquin Hotel Roundtable, quipped in print that Miss Brice had fixed her nose to, quote, spite her race, end quote. 40 years later, when Barbra Streisand refused the same surgery, she was praised as gutsy by many, especially young Jewish women, who are now far removed from the immigrant experience because she insisted on not compromising her identity merely to conform to an abstract American ideal of beauty. An echo of the controversy over negotiating the contested terrain of the body with the assistance of the surgeon's scalpel occurred as recently as last autumn. Tabloids feasted on a story about a television talk show host's cosmetic surgery, a procedure she had undergone 18 years before. The television personality, Julie Chen, a woman of Chinese descent and moderator of CBS's The Talk, had undergone surgery to alter the appearance of her eyes, making them appear more open on the advice of her boss and agent, who told her she'd never make it in TV with Asian eyes. While her parents expressed support for her courage in making the public revelation, Chen was stunned by the avalanche of criticism she received, much of it from within the Asian community. Messages chided her, including, "Way to give in to the Western standards of beauty. You are denying your heritage. You're trying to look less Asian." Chen responded that her capitulation to racism was about the costs of advancing a show business career and, quote, had nothing to do with denying my heritage, end quote. While plastic surgery, for good or ill, was beyond the financial reach of most immigrants, newcomers found other ways to transform their bodies in their bid for a place in American society, particularly in response to nativists who accused immigrants of being unfit for the rigors of life in the United States. For instance, in 1914, E.A. Ross singled out the body of the Eastern European Jewish immigrant who appeared to him wasted and lacking in the physical vitality that he attributed to America's more robust Anglo-Saxon stock. Ross considered these deficiencies that were inborn and then exacerbated by the vicissitudes of life in America. He observed, quote, "On the physical side, the Hebrews are the polar opposite of our pioneer breed. Not only are they undersized and weak-muscled, but they shun bodily activity and are exceedingly sensitive to pain." As evidence, Ross quoted an unnamed settlement house worker who testified, "You can't make Boy Scouts out of the Jews. There's not a troop of them in all New York." I know that's not the case. Another told him, "They are absolute babies about pain. Their young fellows will scream with a hard lick." Students, perhaps in Ross's classes at the University of Wisconsin, confirmed, quote, that husky young Hebrews on the football team lack grit and will take on if they are bumped into hard, end quote. Newcomers were often acutely aware of such assessments. Not all cultures placed a high value on physical exercise or had the opportunity to build healthy bodies through exercise. Some children in the Eastern European Jewish community were made to spend many hours every day in study, their backs bent over books. Others were the victims of child labor, their bodies bent over factory benches. Neither experience yielded healthy, attractive bodies. but habits could and must be negotiated. Children should be encouraged to build their bodies, and their parents must consent. In August 1903, Abraham Kahan, the editor of a popular Yiddish socialist newspaper, the Jewish Daily Forward, and a Russian immigrant himself, published a letter to him from a parent. Quote, "It makes sense to teach a child to play dominoes or chess. But what is the point of a crazy game like baseball? The children can get crippled," end quote. Kahan replied that he thought baseball a good idea for both physical and cultural reasons. He wrote, quote, "Let your boys play baseball and play it well, as long as it does not interfere with their education or get them into bad company. Bring them up to be educated, ethical, decent, but also to be physically strong, so they should not feel inferior." And then he added, "Let us not so raise the children that they should grow up foreigners in their own birthplace. An American who isn't agile and strong in hands, feet, and his entire body is not American," end quote. He understood all too well that the Jewish immigrant must be physically robust and that sports would help Jews to have bodies as strong and as healthy as those of their new countrymen. He also recognized the virtue of baseball as a vehicle of cultural inclusion, much as cultural critic and French immigrant Jacques Barzun did when he wrote 7 decades later in 1973, quote, "Whoever wants to know the heart and mind of America had better learn baseball, the rules and realities of the game." Or much more recently, when historian Gary Gerstle referred to Yankee Stadium, my own personal stomping ground, as a temple of Americanization, end quote. And it is worth noting that the popularity of baseball within immigrant communities and the idealization of the American athlete's physique were not lost on those who ran the game. No less a personage than New York Giants manager John McGraw told a reporter for the New York Trib in the 1920s, "A home run hitter with a Jewish name in New York would be worth $1 million," end quote. Obviously, he was thinking of all those immigrants coming up to the polo grounds from the Lower East Side. The Americanization of the immigrant body and the spirit through exercise was not confined to men. Women also were being encouraged to engage in athletics and to make their bodies healthy, to make their bodies fit. At settlement houses, at YWHAs, at YWCAs, at youth clubs, in high schools, young immigrant women were encouraged to swim, play basketball, learn archery, tennis, basically be fit. If Abraham Kahan, a newspaper editor, did not hesitate to push back against the argument that immigrants were physically unassimilable, neither did immigrant physicians. Too often neglected by historians, I think, foreign-born physicians played the role of cultural mediator in the negotiation between newcomers pursuing assimilation and immigration's opponents. With their eyes on the contested terrain of the foreign body, immigrant physicians defended newcomers to the native-born and made the case to immigrants that they must improve their bodies in the United States. One such mediator was Dr. Maurice Fishberg. Born in Russia in 1872, he migrated to the US in 1889. After receiving his medical degree from New York University in 1897, he was appointed clinical professor of medicine at New York University and Bellevue Medical College. He was also the chief physician of the United Hebrew Charities and an amateur anthropologist. Fishberg could not help but agree with nativists that the bodies of his patients were greatly retarded. However, rather than seeing this as a sign of inherent inferiority, Fishberg attributed the condition to insufficient exercise during childhood, both in Europe and in the United States. In his articles, he argued that nurture, not nature, was responsible for such bodies. Echoing Kahan, Fishberg wrote in one of his articles about the Jewish poor of New York, I want to state right here that what the East Side needs most is gymnasiums. Gymnasiums, like the ones at the Educational Alliance, should be multiplied and the younger generation be attracted to enjoy their benefits, end quote. Exercise could improve both health and appearance, both essential to inclusion. Another physician mediator was the Italian community's Dr. Antonio Stella, like Fishberg, an immigrant himself. However, unlike Fishberg, Stella came from an upper-class background. The son of an attorney, Stella was born in Muro Lucania, a southern province, in 1868. He was educated in Naples at the Royal Lyceum and received an MD from the Royal University in 1893. After graduating, he migrated to the US and became a citizen in 1909. He had an upscale practice and was the personal physician of opera star Enrico Caruso. But he was also a consulting physician at Manhattan Hospital and the Italian Hospital, and a visiting physician at Columbus Hospital, all institutions that treated poor immigrants. Stella was a prolific writer and devoted to bettering the lot of Italian immigrants, as well as defending them against nativist attacks. Commenting on the change in health and appearance of newcomers, he observed this: 6 months of life in the tenements are sufficient to turn the sturdy youth from Calabria, the brawny fishermen of Sicily, the robust women from Abruzzi and Basilicata, into the pale, flabby, undersized creatures we see dragging along the streets of New York and Chicago. Such a painful contrast to the native population. 6 months more of this gradual deterioration, and the soil for the bacillus tuberculosis is amply prepared, end quote. For Stella, constructing gymnasiums was hardly enough. In a passionate 1908 essay, The Effects of Urban Congestion on Italian Women and Children, Stella urged policymakers to engage in social planning and institute a program of education aimed at the individual immigrant. He called for, quote, better distribution of the immigrants, not after they have reached Ellis Island, but before they decide to leave their motherland, by informing them of the wonderful resources of this vast continent outside and beyond the large cities. Let us educate them to the principles of hygiene and life when they are settled here. And above all, let us distribute the work in appropriate areas outside the city limits, so that proximity of the factory should not be the chief reason for their congesting the city, end quote. He also urged the building of model tenements at a low rate, low enough so that it would not absorb more than a third of a worker's salary. He quite explicitly asserted the relationship between improving the physical and moral condition of newcomers, because, quote, when we shall have given the people clean, healthy homes, full of light and sunshine, we shall have accomplished the physical and moral regeneration of the masses. We shall have given them that to which every human being is entitled, health and happiness, end quote. Now, Stella was probably being overly optimistic about the health of immigrants distributed across America, far away from urban tenements. Mexican migrants in rural environs certainly found working in America to be disastrous to their good health. From 1900 to 1930, the Mexican population in the US more than doubled every 10 years. By 1930, an estimated 1.5 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans lived in the US. Most worked as low-paid agricultural or railroad laborers. I don't know where that beeping is coming from. Okay. Though screened at the border, Mexican workers often suffered from poor living and working conditions in the US that compromised the strong bodies with which they hoped to earn their place in America. One nativist denounced Mexicans in a congressional hearing as less intelligent than white Americans and unassimilable because they were, quote, for the most part, Indian, end quote. Poor health was blamed upon their inherent inferiority. In 1914, Dr. Howard King of New Orleans contended, quote, every individual hailing from Mexico should be regarded as potentially pathogenic, end quote. That the Mexican body was considered inherently unhealthy was reflected in government regulations triggered by a 1916 typhus epidemic that was ravaging railroad camps in the American West. The government instructed railroad companies to improve conditions. The companies responded by delineating new rules for immigrant laborers and their families, outlining proper health and hygiene practices. Finding the strictures, quote, offensive and humiliating, a group of Mexican workers objected strenuously and in writing directly to the California State Board of Health, arguing that their employers failed to provide adequately for workers and their families. Those who signed the letter suggested that medical care should be provided and that the railroad should, quote, give us 2 rooms to live, 1 to sleep, and 1 to cook in, and also pay a fair wage to obtain a change of clothes and a bar of soap. This wage, they said, is not enough for nourishment of one person. Health we have. What we need is liberty and the opportunity to achieve it. We need a bathroom in each section of the camp, and the toilets that are now next to the sleeping quarters be moved. Many times their bad smell has prevented us from even eating our simple meal, end quote. These Mexican workers had no doubt that the blame for the typhus epidemic lay not in their own customs and habits or even their own physical constitutions, but in the lap of their negligent employers. In contrast to the California State Board of Health and other such public agencies far removed from the immigrant experience, other public health workers, such as visiting nurses, knew firsthand the conditions in which newcomers lived, particularly the visiting nurses. In New York, Lillian Wald, an American-born social worker of German-Jewish background, coined for the first time the term public health nurse. A graduate of New York Hospital School of Nursing, Wald was studying to become a doctor at the Women's Medical College when she was asked to teach classes in home health care to immigrants on New York's Lower East Side. It was a life-changing experience for her. Visiting an ailing woman in a dilapidated tenement, she witnessed, in her words, quote, all the maladjustments of our social and economic relations epitomized in their brief journey. She dropped out of medical school and moved into a Lower East Side tenement with a fellow nursing school graduate, Mary Brewster. And together, Wald and Brewster provided nursing care as well as ice, sterilized milk, meals, medicine, referrals to clinics and hospitals, and job references. In 1895, they moved into a house in the neighborhood and founded the Henry Street Nursing Settlement, with 6 more nurses, as well as lawyers, union organizers, social reformers, all bent on improving the lot of immigrants. With their broad-brimmed hats and their long skirts, Wald's visiting nurses took shortcuts over tenement roofs to bring health care to tenements, going up and down the stairs and across the roofs into the polyglot neighborhood that included Jews, Italians, Irish, and Chinese immigrants. In 1917 alone, the nursing service provided bedside care to 32,753 patients and saw 21,000 sick children in their homes. Living among her patients as neighbors engendered respect in Wald for the immigrants, as it did for Jane Addams at Hull House. Still, while a great advocate for newcomers' traditions, art, and ideas, Wald, like Fishberg and Stella, did not encourage immigrants to retain the health practices and folk cures of their homelands. Her nurses taught American habits of health and hygiene and offered medical care that reflected the allopathic medical tradition. This was a key concession in the negotiation over health and appearance expected of newcomers. compliance with allopathic medicine or conventional medicine's authority as embedded in the physician and public health authorities. The Southern Italians offer a clear example at the end of the 19th century. In the southern provinces, illness and their remedies were bound closely to a blend of religion and pagan superstition that varied from place to place. Christianity had come to cities long before it reached the countryside, where pagan deities continued to hold the attention of peasants. Consequently, Italian Catholicism south of Rome was blended with traditions and customs of pagan origin. Reliance upon superstition and magic remained especially strong. In spite of regional differences, certain patterns were generally common in the South. Southern Italians often blamed illness or misfortune on men and women who possessed il malocchio, the evil eye of jealousy. The person who had the evil eye, it was believed, could cause physical injury, sickness, or even death with a glance. Coral, silver, gold, or bone amulets representing animals' horns, claws, or teeth could ward off the evil eye. You could hold them up and ward off the evil eye. Those who fell ill often consulted with villagers thought to be wizards or witches who had therapeutic powers of incantation and herbal medicine to relieve suffering. In the U.S., this folk tradition, as well as more conventional religious worship, was often the first line of defense against illness. Educated individuals, including doctors, were frequently held in suspicion. Italian physicians in the U.S. labored mightily to persuade newcomers that scientific medicine was a better choice than amulets, that negotiation was necessary. In 1904, one such physician, Dr. Rocco Brindisi, called for newcomers of his group to conform to the ways of their new home, especially with respect to the care of their bodies. He saw himself as an instrument of transformation, encouraging conformity in matters of the body, while American schools worked their magic to convert aliens into Americans. Quote, "It is education through the public institutions and the missionary work of the physician that will bring the principles of hygiene and their practical benefits into Italian homes, while waiting for the more substantial fruits of the schools," end quote. Gradual change through education was all well and good until an epidemic erupted. Now, the body was more than contested territory. The intensity and fear generated by an epidemic made the immigrant body a virtual war zone. Compliance with the policies of medical authorities was a matter of life and death. During the 1918 influenza pandemic, New York's Il Progresso and other newspapers sought to persuade Italian readers to abandon traditional practices that in times of epidemic might prove harmful. One such practice concerned the routine expression of affection, especially with respect to the young. In January 1919, with the epidemic taking the lives of Americans at a rapid pace, Il Progresso reminded readers one should never kiss children on the mouth and should avoid kissing them as much as possible, end quote. Il Progresso also addressed the importance of physicians, including the Board of Health doctors, and demanded compliance from a community known for its suspicion of authority, both in the southern Italian provinces and the U.S. As well. Edicts of the Board of Health must be obeyed, or the violators would be punished. Habits must be changed. Quote, "Very strict orders have been issued against those who do not scrupulously follow hygienic measures or don't use a handkerchief when they expectorate. These infractions will be punished with both fines and jail time," the newspaper warned. The intensity of this public education campaign is testament to the fact that immigrants had the power to choose to cooperate or not, and the fear was always that they would not. And what of those who were unable to avoid falling sick? How did they defend their bodies against unfamiliar medical practices? Well, many immigrant communities opened their own clinics, dispensaries, and hospitals, waging war against American medical culture by taking the battle onto the home turf. Take, for instance, Chinese immigrants arriving in the late 19th and early 20th centuries who thought US hospitals and operations meant sure death. Western medicine was regarded as barbarian. In 1900, the Chinese Benevolent Association, a powerful fraternal society based on the regional origins of its immigrant members, built its own medical facility, the Donghua Dispensary. In San Francisco's Chinatown, the facility, incorporated into the Chinese hospital in 1925, juggled patient preference and assimilationist pressures by hiring both Western-trained physicians and Chinese herbalists. Individual patients chose the system of medicine in which they had most confidence. Over time, Chinese immigrant patients became more sanguine about Western medicine, but the popularity of herbal medicine and acupuncture in the US demonstrates that negotiations over health care did not automatically result in newcomers deserting their own ways, and some of those ways were adopted by Americans. Moreover, the broad adoption today by non-Asian patients suggests this ever-widening mainstream that Alba and Nee posited. Roman Catholic and Jewish communities also founded institutions sensitive to the confluence of cultural and medical needs of their co-religionists. The presence of clergy and the support of religious customs and traditions, meatless Fridays for Catholics, kosher cuisine for observant Jews, provided environments in which the spiritual comfort of patients and the absence of hostility to their religious traditions could promote healing. But these ethnic hospitals offered much more than creature comfort. Medicalized prejudice in American hospitals constructed definitions of illness that were often quite prejudicial to newcomers. Much as the Mexicans had been blamed for the typhus epidemic, so were other groups with particular diagnoses. In the case of a nervous disease, a neurasthenia, a disease of the nervous system, it was often diagnosed as Hebraic debility. And in the clinical notes, you see the terms Hebraic debility, because physicians associated Jews with highly nervous, emotional dispositions. In other cases, the existence of Jewish hospitals protected patients from having to deal with physicians already predisposed to regard them as inferior. One Boston physician, Dr. Richard Cabot, admitted in a 1931 autobiography that when a Jewish patient entered his office, an immigrant patient, he did not see him as a unique individual, but rather as, quote, a nervous, complaining, whimpering Jew, with his beard upon his chest and the inevitable dirty black frock coat flapping about his knees, end quote. The same disdain and fears of newcomers that led to the exclusion of Southern and Eastern European migrants with the passage of the 1924 Act I mentioned earlier also prompted the exclusion of Chinese and Mexican immigrants later in the 20th century, as historians Nyan Shah, Alexandra Stern, Natalia Molina have all observed. Molina has been especially effective in documenting how public health officers would provide the Border Patrol with copies of detainees' medical records and assist them in making the case that these newcomers could be excluded on medical grounds because they would not be productive as laborers and were likely to become public charges. Medicalized prejudice, competing medical cultures, clashes over the contested terrain of the immigrant body persist into the 21st century. However, as observed by Alba and Nee, the mainstream has widened and accommodates the negotiation that newcomers conduct with American society much more readily. In the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, with its robust population of Hmong and Somalis, Such negotiation is routine. As one physician at the University of Minnesota Community Clinic wrote, "Our attitude is you bring your shaman and we'll bring our surgeon, and let's see if we can work out the problem together." This dialogue at the bedside was described by one doctor as a bidirectional process that permits foreign-born patients to negotiate their treatment with physicians and only accept therapies with which they are comfortable. Medical professionals have become much more sensitive to the fact that a multi-ethnic practice means that the very definitions of illness are up for negotiation. Asian arrivals tend to accept the notion of physical illness much more readily than they do illness that may be the result of psychological causes, such as clinical depression. At the Asian American Family Clinic at Hillside Hospital in Queens, New York, one of the Western-trained physicians reported that the stigma and shame attached to mental illness, which can be so much fiercer in Eastern cultures than in the West, can keep immigrants from seeking treatment. Quote, "Asians are often very reluctant to seek help. They may go to a pastor, a fortune teller, or a friend's mother, but never talk to a shrink," end quote. The staff must perform the difficult task of persuading patients of the reality of mental health and mental health disorders and providing culturally sensitive therapies. Likewise, some mental illnesses are culture-bound, like anorexia nervosa in Western culture. In hospitals with large populations of Asian patients, psychologists are seeing things they never saw before. The Chinese pafeng, a phobic fear of wind and cold. Koreans suffering from wabyung, a suppressed anger syndrome. Malaysians and Indonesians presenting symptoms of lata, a psychosis that leads to uncontrollable mimicking of other people. Therapies prescribed by clinic physicians are complicated. One clinic doctor claims to blend Zen Buddhism, Confucianism, and psychotherapy in treating patients, tailoring the therapy to each patient's culture and needs. Making things even a little bit more complicated is, as one Times headline read recently, "Becoming an American can be bad for your health." There is ample evidence now that the diets and exercise patterns of newcomers are often healthier than those of the same group who have lived in the US longer. Just as Dr. Antonio Stella documented the degeneration of Southern Italian immigrant health a century ago, today, long days of work at low wages leads to less time for outdoor exercise. Likewise, diets of inexpensive junk food takes the place of home-cooked fresh foods as newcomers holding down several low-paying jobs rush from one place of employment to another. According to a 2006 study at the University of California, Mexican immigrants, as opposed to those born and raised on this side of the border, had mortality rates 16% lower from heart disease, 18% lower from kidney disease, 24% lower for liver cirrhosis. Inadequate exercise, poor diet, increased alcohol were all the culprits. As migration to the United States continues, historians have much to offer those pondering how newcomers negotiate assimilation in the past and still do so today. Negotiation over the body is just one aspect of this larger negotiation that I posit as critical to the larger assimilation process. Alba and Nee's wider mainstream also pertains to academia, and that has increased considerably the number of scholars interested in and sensitive to issues of immigration, race, religion, ethnicity, and gender. Glance around this room. The diverse array of racial, religious, ethnic, and gender identities just in this room is striking. as we change who writes history, we find changes in the kind of history being written. A survey done in the late 1990s by sociologist Ruben Rumbaugh revealed that 55% of historians engaged in the study of immigration and ethnicity were, in his words, insiders, writing about the groups to which they describe themselves as belonging. Thus, the broader the scholarly mainstream, the more diverse the number of subjects addressed. Check the titles of the panels in your OAH program if you have any doubts of the veracity of that statement. This diversity in our profession did not happen spontaneously or without struggle. Some of you in this room are old enough, as I am, that you can remember when your department hired the first woman, hired the first African American, hired the first Latino, hired the first Jew. There was a time when those who ran the nation's history departments were reluctant to entrust the teaching of the nation's history to those they regarded as, quote, outsiders, the scholarly parvenu. In 1962, no less a personage than the president of the American Historical Association, Professor Carl Breidenbach, observed that, quote, many of the younger practitioners of our craft and those who are still apprentices are products of lower middle class or foreign origins, and their emotions, not infrequently, get in the way of historical constructions. They find themselves, in a very real sense, outsiders on our past and feel themselves shut out. This is certainly not their fault, but it is true. They have no experience to assist them, and the chasm between them and the remote past widens every hour. What I fear is that the changes observant in the background of the present generation will make it impossible for them to communicate and reconstruct the past for future generations. End quote. Professor Breidenbach need not have feared. The study of the American past is alive and well. The descendants of the slave, the worker, and the immigrant, we women and men of, quote, lower middle class foreign origins, end quote, have done and are doing our duty to tell the story of America's peopling and the rest of this nation's rich, if at times very problematic past. We are doing our duty as defined by Irish author Oscar Wilde when he proclaimed, the one duty we owe to history is to rewrite it. Now I ask you, can there be any higher calling? I think not. Thank you very much. Thank you.